In this chapter, we're going to talk about app services versus app service plans. Which brings me to a phrase that I hear an awful lot that's out in the world: serverless applications or serverless apps. Now, this term serverless is what I think of as a gigantic big old lie. And it drives me kind of crazy when I hear it. Somebody says, yeah, but my app is serverless. Or I want to use Google because it's serverless. Or I want to use AWS because it's serverless. Yeah, whatever. There's always a server. So serverless means you don't worry about the server that your app is hosted on. Well, that's not actually quite true. Serverless implies that you don't worry about the server that your app is hosted on. Now with serverless, remember that there's always a server. Your app doesn't just sort of magically execute in the cloud. There's something that is running your application. There's something that's hosting the files, it's hosting the logic. There is a server somewhere. So, what does serverless actually mean? It means that you mostly don't worry about the server that your app is running on. Now, what does mostly mean? That means you're not worrying about operating system patches. You're mostly not worrying about networking stuff. You're mostly not worrying about hardware stuff. You're totally not worrying about air conditioning and internet pipes into a building and electricity and all that kind of stuff. It's someone else's problem. Now, the goal here with serverless is just to minimize what you have to care about with regard to your hosting environment. And at this point, the server becomes just an abstraction, something that you just don't have to worry too much about. It's there, it's got some configuration, but the real day-to-day details of it are not your problem. Now, Azure App Service web apps are serverless. And notice that I have quotes around the word serverless because there is definitely a server that is running your Azure App Service web app. And this brings us to app service versus app service plans. I really want to stress that this is super important, so make sure that you're paying attention to this thing. App services versus app service plans. Huge thing to know about. An app service plan, this is that abstraction that represents your server in a serverless environment. You don't pay for web apps, but you do pay for app service plans. Under the hood, it's basically a virtual machine running somewhere in Azure. So the scalability stuff and the reliability stuff all kind of starts to align with the virtual machine guidance that Microsoft gives you for Azure. And under the surface, that virtual machine hosts your web apps. Now notice that I'm saying web apps. This is interesting and important. You can host multiple apps inside the same app service plan. Now let's flip the perspective. Let's think about this from the web app. The web app runs inside of an app service plan. You pay for the app service plan. You're basically paying for the virtual machine that hosts your app services. So remember that abstraction that the app service plan is the server. Well, the app service plan is the virtual machine that represents the server that runs your apps. And you can run more than one app inside of the same app service plan. And those apps can have different domains, totally different configurations, but they're all running inside the same app service plan. And here's one of the really important things. Remember that since it's running inside the app service plan, it means that those web apps are all executing on the same virtual machine that represents that plan. So back to why is this so important? The app service plan is what you pay for. So understanding this can save you money. It's also how you scale your application. So you have the option in app services to scale up or scale out. Scale up means that you're going to throw a bigger virtual machine with bigger, more powerful specs at your app services versus scale out, which would mean that you're going to have multiple instances of your app service plan, but that app service plan is running on a VM that maybe is not super powerful. So if someone on your team starts talking about microservices and they're thinking about hosting them on web apps in Azure, make sure that they understand the distinction between the app service plan and the web app. I've definitely seen a handful of customers that have gotten really messed up because they didn't understand this and they end up paying an awful lot of money for their microservice architecture. So, app service plan hosts your web apps. You pay for the plan, you don't pay for the web apps. The app service plan is basically a virtual machine. So, next up, let's do a demo. Let's create an Azure App Service.